All right. So, hope everybody had a good holiday weekend. Hope everybody's still coded most of the days. Hope you still had a little bit of time to relax at the same time. With that said, we're going to jump into middleware. So we've talked about middleware a lot without actually talking about it. It's been brought up. We've been using it. We npm installed it. So what we're going to do is we're going to build out a little bit more on the to-do list, and then we're going to replace the middleware we npm installed with our own middleware. We're just going to recreate the middleware that we npm installed. And when we do that, we'll talk more about what middleware actually is and why it's extremely important in Redux. The good news is, with middleware, chances are you'll never need to write your own. Okay? The reason I still teach it to you guys and teach you guys how to make it is just so you have a better understanding of it. It can help understand the Redux cycle a little bit more. It helps understand what happens between the action creators and the reducers. So it just gives you a little bit more insight into what's actually going on with Redux and why you need middleware and the point of it. By actually building it, you can kind of see what it's doing, which can help with understanding of the whole point of it. So without further ado, go to your terminal, go to your front-end folder, and we'll be continuing on our Redux to-do list. And it's warm here. So from your front-end folder, you should have a folder, something along the lines of Redux to-do list. And before we stopped on Thursday, I believe it was, we merged everything to master. So you should be on master and have the most up-to-date code. We left off with being able to add to-do items to our list. So once you get to the right folder, open your code editor to that folder, start your server. If you do npm start and you get errors, chances are you have another server running. Which is why I like to encourage always to only have terminal windows open to the project you're working on and code editor only open to projects you're working on. And everybody likes to have a million tabs in every single application open, but A, it slows down your computer, and B, it's really easy to code and run commands in the wrong place. Like, I feel like I know what I'm doing pretty well, and I still only keep one set of stuff open for whatever project I'm working on. I don't have multiple projects open ever. Man, that's you guys are just trying to start me off in a bad mood, man.
Okay. That's
You never.
I know.
There's no delete function.
I know.
Who would have guessed who it was? Who would you guess? Damn.
What is that? Of all the jokesters you have,
Yeah.
You're the real one.
I'm not a master.
Going to every class, at least one person does. I'm no longer surprised by it. All right, so your to-do list should look something similar to this. Maybe not exactly, but similar. Oh, is there new Chrome stuff? Or is this still the same shit? I don't get that whole thing. Whatever. Should be able to add an item, so we should be able to do And once you add an item, it should redirect you back to your main list. Everything should work. Does anybody not have the to-do list in a similar fashion? Some differences are okay, like I said, as long as the overall functionality is the same. Everybody's good? Everybody has a project open, ready to go? Anybody still need a second? You guys came back fully recharged from a 4-day weekend or what?
So excited.
So excited? I was excited to come back just to see you guys.
You don't have to lie.
Hey man, 4 days was a long time.
Realized that we were your true family.
I did. The holiday always brings that out. Reminds me of who my true family is. All right. So although we're talking about middleware, we're not going to be just building middleware. So we're not going to call our branch middleware. What we're going to do is set up the details view. And once we have the details view working, mostly, then we're going to set up our own custom middleware. So for our branch name, oops, that's not good for the computer or the HDMI cable. Come on. Nope, nope, oh, come on, you can do it. So that was when you step on it. Here we go. I have faith in it this time. There we go. Make sure the recording is still going. Technical difficulties. All right. So I'm going to do my branch name of git checkout -b, and it will be the details -page. And it's going to be the same thing we did before with the other to-do list version where we save the ID number up in the URL and then use the information from the URL to call the server. The reason we're doing it again, though, is because it's a very, very important concept. The process really won't be much different than it was before. Even though we're using Redux, it's still pretty much the same. But once again, it's an extremely important concept to cover. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new component. And I'm going to call it view_item.js. And then, like every time we're starting a new component, we need to try and ask ourselves, well, what kind of component do we want to make? And view item, we need to call the server to get the data. So if we need to make a server call, when do we usually want to make that server call? When the component gets added to the DOM, right? So when the component mounts. So if we need to know when the component mounts, what type of component do we need to make? Class component, because we need a lifecycle method to tell us, hey, the component's been added to the DOM. So we'll make a class component. We'll import React, pull off component, all from React. Anybody follow any podcasts or read any new updates about React recently? No? Yeah. Next React version, they're proposing to add state functionality to functional components. It's not quite as powerful as what a class component could do, but so you could add small amounts of state to a functional component.
Can you do that?
No. No, there's no way to add state to a functional component.
No, you can't pass it props.
You can pass it props, but that's props. It's different than state.
Okay.
So the component name will be view item. Oops, not from. Extends. I found it interesting because the guy that wrote the article, his whole reason was that he had a functional component that he wanted to add state to, and he didn't want to refactor it. And to me, that is the most lazy reason I've ever heard in my life. It takes like 2 seconds to refactor a component. So we'll just set this up with a div, and we'll just throw an H1 in here that says view item. And finally, we will export default. Oh, and the name of the component would help. Yeah, shit, 4 days, I'm rusty. All right, so just a base setup for a class component, like we've done every other time. Nothing fancy. Everybody good? So what we want to do next is set up the routing for it. So all of our routing is set up in app.js. Anybody need a second with view item? All good? So we'll jump over to app.js. Up at the top, we will import our newly created component. And then we'll create a route for it. All right, and we'll say /item. And this is where we set up our URL parameter so we can hold the item's ID. So we'll say colon, and then we'll give it some name. And in this case, we'll just call it item _ ID. And then for component, we'll set that to our view item component, like so. Yes.
Could you remind me why we did the colon item ID?
The colon is to create a variable in the URL. So that way we put any information after this /. So in the URL, we're about to test it. It'll be /item / and then anything else after it. And then we could access anything. We could access the information that'll be here inside of our props object under params item _ ID. We'll go through it again.
So how come we don't put view item after the / just item?
You could if you wanted to. You're defining what you want the URL to be to load that component.
Oh, good.
Yeah, this path is completely unrelated to like the file path or anything. This is just what the URL is going to be to show that component. And you're defining it right here. So whatever you make it here is what it's going to be. All good? Good. All right, so we're going to test this. So we said this component should render when our URL is /item / anything else. So inside of our browser, we'll host 3000 /item and then / anything else. And then you should see view item. And we made a horrific mistake. Everybody good? Everybody having trouble? So before we go any further, we got to fix our very, very bad mistake. And that is we didn't center our H1. Just add a class name of center on our H1. Disaster averted. I feel better about the day now. All right, final call. Anybody need a second? Anybody is not working? All good?
That class was already created. The center class.
It's for materialize. Do you need help, Sasha? Or?
Does that mean yes? It's like
This is as good as mine. All right, so now that we have our components showing up successfully, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to populate the URL with the item ID of each item. And we could do that if we go back to our list, and from our list, if we make each item clickable. So if you click on an item, I can then update the URL to be /item / the ID of that item. So in the list component, I feel like I was going to say more, but that pretty much sums it up. First thing we'll do is we need to be able to create links. So what do we use to create links to other routes? Link. So link, the component, so it's capitalized, and it comes from React router DOM. And then we want to add a link inside of each LI. So where we're looping through our data and building out our LIs, right at the top of the render method, I'm going to surround that in parentheses. I'm going to break it up onto a couple different lines just to make it a little bit more legible. Doing stuff like this changes absolutely no functionality. It is literally just making it easier to read for us humans. All right. So now that I've opened that up a little bit, I'm going to highlight where I have item.title, including the curly brackets. I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to put a link, opening and closing tag, and then paste my item.title back inside of there. Okay, so now the title will be the link. That'll be the blue text that we could click on to view that item. And then we need to tell the link where to go to when it's clicked on. So we'll say 2 equals curly brackets, backticks, and we want it to go to /item like we just defined, and then /, and then we want the item's ID. And we're already using the item's ID for the key. So we know how to access the ID, item dot underscore ID. So /$ curly brackets, item dot underscore ID. And that will build the proper link to each individual item. And then we should be able to test this. If you still need the code, I'll come right back to it. But your end result should look something like this. All your items should now be blue when you go to localhost 3000 on your home page. And you should be able to click on one of these. And it should take you to view item. And you should have a big crazy string up in the URL. Okay, your string's going to be different than mine because your items have different IDs, but it should look similar. And if I go back and click on a different one, then it'll have a different ID up there. Okay, the whole point is to get the item's ID into the URL. Yes, sir.
If we wanted to make that whole the whole box, the whole div that's containing like the to-do, we would wrap the li in the link?
No.
No?
No. I should do it. Pretty close anyway. Double check that. Come back to it. Yeah, so you can see now, like when I highlight over here, it has the link. And all that did, just using some kind of basic CSS, is I turn my anchor tag into a block level element, so it would take up the full width automatically, and then just set the height to 100% of its container. So you can see it takes up almost the whole container, minus the padding that's on the LI. And if you wanted to make it the whole thing, you could remove the padding from the LI and add some margin or padding to the anchor tag to make it look the same. So.
Can we go back to the code for a
Mm-hmm.
Why'd you have to put in 2 curly brackets?
So the first curly brackets is going to JavaScript mode.
Okay.
And then what's the second curly brackets for? What is that? It's an object. It's just I just defined an object.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
It's an object literal.
Gotcha.
Yep. You could also do something like same exact thing. This would probably technically be slightly more efficient
Electric?
this way because it's referencing the same object every time. You would never notice it in a million years though, but technically speaking, this should be slightly better. But like not to the point that I would purposely go out of my way to do it this way. Yep, so just remember curly bracket, whenever you're in JSX, you got to use curly brackets to go into the JavaScript mode. So then if I wanted to declare an object, you have to do another set of curly brackets for the object. Angular, I don't know if they still do, I'm pretty sure they still do, but they actually use their version of this, and Angular is actually double curly braces. So like enter like a quasi JavaScript mode. It's a little bit different though, it's not quite JavaScript. All right, how's everybody doing? Everybody get their links working? All good? All right, so you should be like, have this. If you didn't add the CSS, then you have to click on the text. If you just added that CSS we added, you should be able to click pretty much anywhere on each item. And as mentioned before, it should take you to your view item, and the URL should have the ID in it. So now we're all set up to use the information from the URL and make a request to the server to get that particular item's information. So from view item, where is it we want to call the server? We just talked about it. When the component mounts, so component did mount is where we want to call server. So component did mount. Now, before we do anything, we need to figure out how to pull that ID in the URL. We need to figure out how to get the ID from the URL. So to do that, to figure out where that information is, I'll give you guys the first hint. View item props. And we'll console log out our props. And then I want somebody to tell me, how do I get to the item ID? This dot props dot what? Where do we find the item ID at?
Location.
Nope, not location.
Match.
Okay, dot match. That's the first step.
Correct.
Dot match. I can't spell match. Dot match. And then dot params. And then dot params is an object which will have our actual item ID. So if we just console log params, you can see we have an object with item underscore ID. And that goes back to the routing that we defined that a couple of you guys asked about. So let's talk about that one more time. So whatever we add after the colon will show up in that params object when we go to this route. Okay, you are creating the property name in the params object. So if I change this to Fluffy Dan's, sounds like a band name. You can see now the item ID is stored at the key name Fluffy Dan's. So you are making that key name. Whatever you put the colon in front of, you're saying, hey, I want to create a URL parameter called whatever. And so when I go to that route, I can find information in the URL at that location. Yes.
Where exactly is the prompt being sent directly to the item?
Route sends it.
Route sends the
Yep.
prompts.
When when route calls this component, it passes it all the routing information.
Okay, so the routing information would include the item ID, even if
Yes.
you change the fluffy dance.
Yeah, we don't do any of that. It all happens behind the scenes. All the routing, you have route adds 3 properties to your props. That's the location object, history object, and the match object. And then the match object is what contains URL parameters. Location object contains all the information about your location. History object has to do with rerouting and where people have been.
So that just like always happens.
Any component that is passed into route. Route adds that information to it. And then I know we talked about this before, but I just want to reiterate, you could actually have multiple of these. So I could say :animal / name. Okay. Now if in my URL is expecting 3 different segments: /item, /animal, whatever that means, /name. Okay, so these are colons. That means I'm creating URL parameters here and here. And I put any information I want here, and I put any information I want here. So to test that and see what it's going to look like, I could update my URL. Notice this URL no longer works because there's no longer anything defined for item /one thing. We need to add a second thing. So I can say /cat /Tom. And then we could see now in our params object, we have animal cat, name Tom. Okay. Anybody dabbling in backend and using Node, Node's routing works the exact same way. You could create URL parameters in your Node routing as well. And you should. It's a nice, clean way of passing information. It's the way most modern websites are built nowadays. All right, I'm going to change this back to what it was. So item _ID.
Can you repeat what the match location and history
What part of it?
of what they each represent?
Yeah. So if we just console log our props from view item, we have a history, a location, and a match. Okay, these 3 properties, history, location, and match, those get added by the route component. So any component that is passed into route will get those 3 properties added to it. It is all your routing information. So if I console log props of list, it's going to have those same 3 properties: match, location, and history. Same with that item, same with view item as we're actually looking at right now. Any routed component has that information in it. Okay? Now you're going to run into, and if we have time, I'm going to purposely run us into it, where you have components that aren't routed directly, that aren't being passed into route, but you still need that routing information. Maybe you need access to history so you could redirect somewhere. Maybe you just need access to the URL. There is React Router has a higher order component that will add those 3 pieces of information onto any component. So hopefully we get to an actual demonstration of that. If not, I'll work it in with our next app. All of that aside, so these 3 things, any directly routed component will have this information on it. History. History tells you information about the history, where the person's been on your site. It was also used to programmatically route someone. What I mean by that is that history has functions in it to change the location of the browser for you. Location has direct information about the URL. It is very similar to the actual window.location object that's part of JavaScript in general. You can type window.location in your console. This is just part of JavaScript. It has nothing to do with anything else. And you can see it has information in it. It's a little bit more robust than React routers, but that's what they base theirs off of. So it has the full path name of what the URL is. It has any search params, any hash stuff. It has a unique key. So it knows that if you rerouted to this page, like let's say someone clicked on another link that took them back to this same page, your component doesn't necessarily re-render anything. However, this key changes so you know that this is a different time you viewed it. That's much more advanced stuff that you most likely won't need in the near future, if ever. All right, so that's location about where you're at. Match has to do more with what the original path that was defined. You can see path here. You can see what our original definition was. Okay, notice it didn't replace the ID like every place else has. It's saying, hey, this is what the original route definition was. That does come in handy down the road. Yes.
I don't have the C thing under location.
Just expand it.
I'm still not there.
Oh, okay. It's not. I don't know why, but it's not hurting anything.
Okay.
That's weird. I don't know. It was just the way I navigated to mine. Should always be there though. Huh. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I'd have to look at it. No idea why it's not there. And then, so match has information about like the original definition. It also has information about the URL parameters, which is what we care about right now. Inside of match is params. Okay, so that's any URL parameters you define for this route. If there isn't any, it'll just be an empty object. It also has information if the path was exact. Is it an exact match to the definition? In this case, it is. So anything related to the URL in your routing can be found in these three properties. Most of the time, until you get into more complex stuff, location and match will seem very similar. But as you get into nested routing and stuff like that, you'll notice differences between the two. But like in this example, like the path name and URL in here, everything's like the same. But if you have more advanced routing set up, there will actually be differences between those two. All right. Very important to know those are there. Obviously, you don't have to memorize what all of them contain. Just know they're there. And if you need any routing information, just console all your props and see what you need.
So for this reason, we can use it history to go back and forward. Can we use this? Like,
yeah, that's what history is for. So history.push is to go somewhere. Okay. There's also a go back, go forward. You gotta be kind of careful with go back and go forward because those are extremely dependent on whatever page the person was previously at, and then go forward only works if they've gone back first. So I kind of tend to stay away from these. There are good reasons for them. It's just my personal bias that I stay away from them. Doesn't mean they're bad to use. But push, you could directly tell it where to go. Replace, I believe replace allows you to update the URL without actually re-navigating, is what replace does.
but in, like, let's say in our application, you're gonna have like button go back, so you're gonna use this information, right?
Yes.
Go to your review item file. So we don't all need to have the match doctrine anymore. In the console log.
It doesn't matter, man. I'm just showing you guys where information's at. The console log doesn't affect how the application runs.
Is the go back and go forward what Chrome actually uses for the back?
It uses, because once again, there's go back and go forward functionality built into JavaScript. JavaScript is just using that functionality. Chrome, I'm sure, uses its own internal thing to handle that. Chrome's is a little bit more sophisticated. But it's the same concept. And like all this go back, go forward, you could do all this with core JavaScript. You don't need React Router to do that. It's almost just as simple to do it in core JavaScript as it is with this. However, when you're using React Router, you want to use the built-in functionality so React Router is aware of what you're doing. So it's able to keep track of what you're doing, and it works all together. But if you weren't using React Router, you could do all this stuff yourself. Or even if you're not using React, you could still do all this stuff yourself. There's all kinds of routing information built into JavaScript. JavaScript is strictly built for web development. So it has all kinds of stuff to interact with the browser. Tons of stuff that I don't even know about. There's so much crap that JavaScript could do. It's impossible to know all of it. Or somebody out there does. All right. So now I am going to console log it out just so everybody can see it. Just for you, man. So before we went down that rabbit hole, we were concerned about pulling this ID from the URL. And as you guys found, you guys did a great job. Found it's on .match.params, which it itself is an object that then has our item ID in it. So we could directly console log our item ID by saying .item_ID. And at this point, I do want everybody to update their console log to match mine, to make sure that you are seeing the item ID. So when we do the next step, if anything goes wrong, we know at least we do have the proper item ID.
You can just underscore it here, just underscore dot underscore ID.
.item_ID.
Okay.
And the capture item / all that is like automatically generated. Like that huge, like whatever you have.
It's not that it's automatically generated. We're setting it to the item ID right here. So whatever our item's ID is, it's put in there. So we're just building a string here. So when we click on a link, it'll take us to /item/ whatever that particular item's ID is.
I was confused by this item dot underscore ID and after I have item underscore ID, so make sure.
Two completely different things, though. That's where it's important to understand where the information is coming from. Here, we just define this as item underscore ID. So in our console log, that's the information we're trying to get at.
Can you go back to the app really quick?
They having trouble?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I wasn't seeing. But basically, this would be just whatever I.
No. So go back home. Okay, click on one of your items. Nope. Go back. Oh, put them on the items. There you go. I got you. All right, so now we should have a console log that has our item ID on in it. And once again, the whole point of doing this is no matter how many times we refresh the page, we're still able to get our item ID right here, which means we still have access to our item ID to send it to the server no matter what. A problem a lot of people run into early on is thinking that when I click this right here, I'm going to call the server and get the data here, which will work the first time you do it. If I click here, it calls the server, gets the data, and then redirects me here, but never updates the URL. Yes, I'm going to see the data the first time I do it, but if I refresh the page, that data is gone because now I'm not clicking on the link that gets the data or clicking on the button that calls the server. You want the page load to call the server and get the data. Always, 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 which means you always need to save enough information in your URL that if the page is refreshed, you have enough information to recall the server and get whatever data that person was previously looking at. Sometimes you need to save search terms up there. If someone types a search into a search bar, and then it takes them to a search results page. If they refresh the page, they're probably going to want to still see the same search results. So you need to save whatever they searched for in the URL. The URL is very powerful that way and could store very important information, making your app a lot more user-friendly. All right, so now that we have access to our item ID, we need to make a request to the server to get our items information. We then need to take our items information and save it into the Redux state. So when we're going to change the Redux state, that means we need to make an action creator. So we can dispatch some type of action to update the state. Okay. Redux state is changed from actions. Action creators are what send out those actions. So up in our actions folder, whenever we're going to make a new action and a new action creator, first thing we need to do is define a action type. So we'll go to our types file. And we'll add a new type of get underscore single underscore item. Get underscore single underscore item. The names of these don't have any special power. Okay. The only special power it has is to help your debugging down the road when your application grows a lot more complex, which is why you should give them good names and good text. Other than that, whatever text you put into each of these properties doesn't matter. As long as they're different, you can put ASDF, ASDF1, ASDF2, and it would still all work the same. But people will be looking at your code and people will be editing your code, so you want to make your code as readable as possible. You don't want to be an a-hole about it. Once we've defined our type, we'll define a new action creator. So we'll jump over to index. And our action creator is going to look pretty much like the other ones. We're going to say export function get single item. All right. Now, we do need a piece of information to get a single item. We need to know which single item to get. So what information are we probably going to pass into our function? The ID, the thing we've been just fussing over in the URL. All right, so the rest is going to be set the same. Const response equals axios dot get. Now this time the URL is going to be a little bit different because we need to add in our item ID. So I'm going to say backtick. It's backtick $ curly brackets, our base URL. And then we're going to say / $ curly brackets the ID. And then we're going to add the API key onto the end of that. That's the same as doing it this way. I know some of that concatenation kind of throws people off a little bit. So you don't have to copy this part. I'm just showing you what it's actually building. C9.18 demo user. All right, so both of these lines are exactly the same thing. Here we're just using variables to create this because we already stored the base part of this URL and our API key in variables at the top of this file. So this information is the exact same information that's here. All right, I just know the concatenation could kind of throw people off and it's hard to visualize for some. So that is the request we're making. All right, and then finally we need to send our action off to the reducer, which is also called dispatching the action. And we do that just by returning the object. And remember, an object in this case is the action. All actions have to have a type property. And we'll set it to types dot get single item. And then the payload will be the response from the server. So if you look at this file as a whole, we've made 3 functions. And they're pretty darn similar. There's just little small differences. In this one, we're making a post request, and the type is set to add list item. This one, we're making a get request, get all list data. This one's a get request. URL is a little bit different. But other than the minor differences of the URL, the method, and the type changing, the actual format of each of these is pretty much identical. Okay? That's the same with Redux. There's a lot taken in the beginning, but ultimately it's just a lot of the same stuff over and over and over again. It's not much more complicated than what you've already learned. Okay? It's just, once again, as already mentioned, it's just getting over that initial kind of hump of understanding. But once you get over that, it's pretty straightforward, and it's just the same crap over and over and over again. All right. So now that we've got our get single item action creator built, we can go to the next step. Where does anybody know or remember, where does the action go from here? Where does this object go? What's its next stop? The reducer. Okay? which is only halfway true. And that's when we enter middleware, but we're not going to talk about that quite yet. Okay, so we're going to jump over to the reducer where this object's going to go from here, ultimately. So I'm going to go to reducers, list reducer, and I'm going to set up a case for the new type I just made. So I'm going to say case types dot get single item. In it, I'm going to console.log get single item. I'm going to console log my action. And then I'm just going to return state unchanged at the moment. I don't want to change anything. I just want to test it right now. The whole purpose of what I'm doing right now is just to test the response I'm getting back from the server. So we defined our function. When this function gets called, it's going to return this object, pass it into the reducer as the second argument, which will be action. We're going to check the type property. And when it matches, we should see a console log of whatever data we got back from the server. Okay? The last step to do is to actually call this function now. Okay? Where do we want to call that function? Where do we need to get the single item data?
In view item.js.
In view item.js. Does anybody need a second here or the reducer?
On the reducer.
On the reducer. That's it, guys. I can't take it anymore. No, we're gonna take a break in a couple minutes. If you could make it like 5 minutes.
Oh, I can make it.
I just go to my camera. How we doing, guys? There's nothing you can really test yet. So if you're tripping that something's not working, then you can't really test it. Other than your code's not exploding.
I'm good.
How are you doing, Sasha? You good? All right, so now that we got that all set up, we need to actually use it. So in view item, we need to set up being able to use it. So if we want a component to interact with Redux in any way, what do we need to import first? If we either need to change the state or pull information from the state, there is one high order component that we have to use. Connect. So whenever a component's interacting with the Redux state, Redux store, whatever you want to call it, whenever a component is interacting with that in any way, shape, or form, you always need connect. Connect is what connects Redux to your component. And that comes from React Redux.
Can you explain why again connect and certain things are in curly braces? Like when you import them and some items are not?
For the 1 millionth time, I will. Just for you.
Thank you.
So, everybody listening? Can anybody else explain it? You know the difference?
I don't know.
Go for it. He's more confident.
If you export default of something, then you can call it whatever you want. But if it's like a named export, which means you don't have export defaults, export whatever it's called, then you have to have the curly braces. And for like React Redux, that library, whatever, they have it as a name. But name.
If you import function, which one is actually that name function, then you put in curly braces, then you import something wherever you can do it.
Yep, and so you guys are both right. So, but to illustrate this more directly, let's look at our code really quick. Okay, where we've done view item, we're using the default keyword. So when we import view item into app, we don't use curly braces because we use the default keyword, so we don't use curly brackets. Now, conversely, if we look at our actions index where we're exporting multiple functions and we're giving them a name, these are called named exports. So if we look to where we're using one of these, add to do item, so export function, no default keyword. We can see here we're using the curly brackets. So curly brackets is for when it's not a default export. It is a named export. So we have to call it by its exact name that it was exported by. And those are denoted how JavaScript knows the difference is when we add curly brackets, we're saying check this file for something being exported by this exact name. Does that help?
Yeah.
Everyone, every class always has a really, really hard time with that stuff. Yes, sir.
When you're like importing React from the React file, it's grabbing everything, but you import the component directly so that it's easier to change.
Yeah, so you can think of it as, okay, so they define their file.
Yeah.
And they've put React into some giant class or object or whatever, and then they've exported that whole thing. Now there's methods or other things they've defined inside of that file, like component, that they've just done export without default and said, here, export component, so that could be pulled out separately. Now it actually works, just to add confusion to it, it actually works different with predefined libraries because they actually use the node module system, the common JS system. So it actually works a little bit differently, but ultimately the concept is the same. Just if you ever look at like the React code, be like, hey, I don't see any export defaults anywhere in here. It's because they use module they use exports dot whatever and module dot exports.
And then connect is lowercase because it's a higher order function or because
Yes.
of how they structure it?
Yeah, connect is lowercase because it's not a component. It is a higher order component, but it's not a component, it's just a function. And we're going to talk about higher order components. It's on the schedule for today. I doubt we'll get to it. So we'll talk about it on Wednesday. We might briefly talk about it today, but I doubt it. Which will shed some light on the mystery of Connect a little bit. So export default, no curly brackets. Export with something that's named, and it's curly brackets. And that's when you can pull multiple things from the same file. Any other questions on that? Okay. Wait till Wednesday till someone asks me again.
Let's reduce your file.
I say stuff like that, guys, completely joking. Like importing and exporting stuff's hard to wrap your brain around. Are we having trouble or what's up?
No.
Okay. All right. So back to view item. So now that we've imported connect, now we do need to import that function that we just defined over in the actions index. And then as we just talked about, it is a named export. So we need to use curly brackets to import it, and we need to call it by its actual name, which is get single item. A lot of times what I'll do for the named ones is I'll say curly bracket from backend directory actions. And then I let the autocomplete go just to make sure that I type it correctly. Problem with that is autocomplete with import statements can be a little finicky sometimes. So don't want to use it as 100% crutch. Use it as a tool with understanding that it might mislead you sometimes.
And anytime you don't directly define a file, it's going to look for index?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so here we're specifying the actions folder. It'll automatically look for an index file in there.
If it doesn't find it, is there another file that defaults?
It'll throw an error. No, it'll throw an error. There is a way to change the default file it looks for, though. And we'll, hopefully, in our next project, we'll get to show that. Sometimes I get to it, sometimes we don't. It's not hugely important. It's just kind of a neat trick. All right, so now that we have connect, we have our action creator imported. Now we need to set up connect down at the bottom. So down where we're exporting, we're going to say connect. We're going to call connect. Connect's going to return a function. We're going to call that function and pass it our component. And then connect takes 2 arguments. And remember what the first argument of connect is. It's a function for, I heard someone over here.
Map state to props.
Map state to props. Now we don't have map state to props, so what do we use as a placeholder if we're not using it? No. And then the second one is our map dispatch to props, which we don't do it that way because it's more complex. So we just say this is our action creators object. This is the second argument. Action creators object. All right, and in it we'll say get single item is set to our get single item function we just imported. This object from connect will get added to our component's props. So we should be able to say this.props.get single item, which we'll call our function. So up in component did mount, I'm going to say this dot props dot get single item. It is a function, so I'm going to call it. And then we need to pass it the item ID. So to get the item ID is this big, ugly, long chain here. So this dot props dot match dot params dot item ID. I'm just going to copy it from here because I know it's right because we tested it. Paste that in there. All right, and we should be able to test that. That should, in theory, we should see a console log. The console logs are action from the reducer file, and it should have information from the server in it. If you still need the code, I will switch right back to it. I'm just going to verify this works. So I can see from my list reducer, I have my object, type of get single item. Payload has a data property, which success, and then it has the to-do item, which has all the detailed information about one particular to-do item. Now, once again, the really important takeaway from this is that we're pulling information from the URL, using that information to call the server to get a particular piece of information from the server. Anybody having any trouble? So double check that you got your URL correct. Make sure you got the little / and stuff in there. Don't know what the error actually is. Anybody else? Here's any help? So something from the type property, action index. Get single item, go to the types file. Because single item twice for using your autocomplete. Save it. Yeah, okay. All right, anybody else? Everyone's good. Everybody's getting the console log with the that actually has data from the server. Cool. Just gonna take a break. We'll meet back at let's say about 12:50.